Yeah, I suppose it's very hard to predict what industries will emerge, what kinds of jobs will emerge when it's so many steps down the line, just as it would be difficult in 1900 to imagine. You talked about in 1900, if we trained an LLM back then, how it might not have predicted that humans would be able to fly. Likewise, it would be difficult to envision that a century later, we would have so much around the airplane industry, all these kinds of jobs that are supported, people cleaning airports and selling snacks at airports, baggage handlers. All these kinds of jobs would be difficult to foresee, with that new innovation. um, as a quick kind of anecdotal story, I recently flew from San Francisco to Australia. And in San Francisco, one of the things that I love to do is ride in fully self-driving Waymos. They're often can arrive more rapidly, and are more affordable, and frankly, even seem safer to me than being in an Uber or a Lyft or a taxi. And after flying from San Francisco to Australia, I I couldn't hail a Waymo today in Sydney, and so used Uber. And the I had a particularly chatty Uber driver, and he says, "Oh, what do you do for a living?" And I explained, "Oh, I do this AI stuff." And he says, "Oh, yeah, it's white collar work is." He was actually pretty well informed about AI innovation, and he said, it's interesting how white collar work is being displaced more rapidly. And I said, yes, but there are some interesting categories where it isn't just white collar work. For example, I just flew from San Francisco where I was in a fully autonomous Waymo. And to him, he was kind of like, well, but, do you trust that? Would you actually, that's how it came up. He said, would you trust being in a fully self-driving car? And to which I responded, actually, I just came from San Francisco, and I said I actually prefer that experience in a Waymo over an Uber. And so absolutely I do feel safer. I'm not sure if I would necessarily feel safer in a Tesla, which is only relying on computer vision, but in the kind of lidar based system that Waymo uses and a lot of the self-driving companies use, it feels extremely safe. And so yeah, so I think this is kind of yeah, it shows a lot of people aren't expecting what's coming, even if it's your job. And so it seems like there's a good chance that AI's job displacement in the coming years and wage changes will be substantial. Are there lessons we can draw from the previous industrial revolutions to enact sensible policies that will balance innovation with worker protection and ease the social shocks?
So first of all, I think what you just described is very similar to the sentiment and the debates that people had around the automatic elevator, right? So a lot of people, or at least the unions, argue that most people would not feel comfortable going into an elevator with no operator responsible for their safety. And then obviously there was all sorts of accident with elevator operators doing all sorts of mistakes, and some of them ended up being even fatal. And so I think there is tendency often to think that humans trust humans more, but uh, I think there's not that much required for us to be convinced that that is not the case when we see the performance of these technologies. And so, as more and more people will come in contact with driverless cars, as you just described, I think that's going to change very, very quickly. And as a bit of a side note, back in our 2013 paper, most of the jobs that we estimated are fully automatable, right? They are in transportation and logistics, and I think we're still just very much at the beginning of that transformation. When it comes to white collar work, I think it's true that for the most part, right now, it's not the entire job that is going to be replaced, or certain tasks within. But I think it's also true that AI is making a lot of white collar work, a lot of creative work much, much easier. And if it becomes easier, then it reduces barriers to entry. So it's a bit like GPS technology in taxi services. So you know GPS technology essentially meant that knowing the name of every single street in Oxford was no longer a particularly valuable skill. And so when Uber came along, anybody could essentially get into his or her car and then top up their incomes on the side. With professional service jobs on top of that, those jobs are not those jobs are tradable, right? And so it means that you know if you think about, let's say, the work of an accountant in New York City earns a six digit salary. An accountant in Manila earns a lower four-digit salary, right? And so if AI reduces the productivity differential between those workers, I think it's very likely that we're going to see a lot of white collar work moving across borders to places where labor is cheaper. And then obviously for white collar professionals in Europe and the United States, well, the effect on them is the same as if their job were automated, even though what AI is currently doing is just reducing barriers to entry in these professions. Now, what should governments do? I think what you don't want is governments. You want government to protect people, but not jobs. And so, you know, if you look at Europe, right, where you have strong employment protection, what that means is that when a technology like generative AI arrives, firms like S&P, they find it very hard to adjust because they can't just hire and fire. Whereas firms like Meta and Google, they can pivot much more quickly, and that I think is a drag on the European economy. At the same time, you want to have a social safety net that takes care of people, and that means that the broader population see the benefits also from the technological changes that we're seeing. So in my previous book, The Technology Trap, I make the case that the Luddites, they were essentially right to riot against the mechanized factory because they were not the ones who stood to benefit from it, right? Wages in Britain were stagnant and even falling for two decades, right? And two generations lost out, and it took a long time to see the benefits of new technologies for most people to see those benefits in their pockets. And what you also see is that in places in Britain where the poor laws at the time were more generous, you saw less social unrest as a consequence. So Britain was the only country in the world at the time to tax itself 2% of GDP to provide for the poor. And that actually had an impact on whether workers would riot against mechanization or not. And when autonomous cargo trucks arrived in LA, there was a huge strike. When the same technology was used in the harbors of Norway and in the Netherlands, no reports of such incidents. So I'm very much in favor of Danish style flex security, flexible labor markets, but then actual security also when you lose your job.